Welcome to Future Human, the series, the podcast where the team here at Silicon Republic explores the future of everything. I'm Anne O'D. In this episode, we're thinking about the future of food and the challenges we face as our population grows and our climate changes. This series is made possible by our presenting sponsor, Hays, that's Hays, is the world-leading expert in recruitment and workforce solutions, specialising in the professional and technical sectors and skills. Thanks to their support, the rest of this episode will be totally ad-free. To access great advice and insights, visit haztechnology.com/blogs. Everyone has a right to nutritious and affordable food. In international law, that right is built into the right to an adequate standard of living in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what does that look like? Well, in every part of the world, food must be available in local shops or markets. It should be affordable enough so that everyone has access, and it should be adequate, meaning it should be nutritious and safe. This is what we mean when we talk about food security, something that is becoming increasingly fragile in many parts of the world, especially with climate change increasing the incidence of floods and droughts and impacting the production of crops. And with global conflict impacting local communities, disrupting global food supply chains and raising food prices. Now, with food security rising and hundreds of millions of people facing hunger, how can new technologies help? In this episode, we wanted to get a sense of the tech innovations that might help us secure this fundamental human right to food. We started out by getting a sense of the challenge at hand. Jenny Darmody from our team spoke with Tony Hunter, a food futurist with extensive experience in food science and the food industry, and a fascinating perspective on how technology might pave the way to a more equitable and sustainable future.
Can you paint me a bit of a picture of what the challenges that we're facing at the moment in terms of the food industry?
I think the biggest challenge we've got at the moment in the food industry is looking to the future. It's a cliche, but it doesn't make it any less true. We have 10 billion people to feed by 2050, an extra 2 billion people, rising middle classes, and we are at, if not having breached, planetary boundaries for arable land and fresh water. Question is, how do we meet the demand without creating countries with haves and countries with have-nots in terms of, sustainable, healthily and equitably feeding people on the planet?
There's a massive overproduction in food in some respects and so much waste that happens. And then on the other side of the world, there's massive food shortages. Do you see innovations, technology or strategies being able to help that in the future?
I often get this argument when I talk about new technologies, but we grow enough food on the planet to feed everybody. Why do we need these new technologies? And I say, there is the world as we would like it to be, and there is the world as it is. In the world as it is, there's not enough food. That's the end of the story. And I think if we look at trying to reduce things like food waste, we look at the UK back under COVID, self-reported in-home food waste dropped dramatically under lockdowns. Guess what happened after the lockdowns finished? It went back up to 2019 levels. I think that reducing food waste in-house, in-home, which is up to, depending where you are in the world, 30 to 40 or 50% of all food waste, is going to take generational change. We don't have generations to wait. And the other one you hear is the World Resources Institute says, all we need to do is send all the food from the people who eat too much to the people who need it. Just get them to stop eating so much. And to which I say, we've been telling people in industrialized food system countries to eat less food for decades, or they will die of lifestyle-related diseases like obesity and type 2 diabetes. I don't see saying, please eat less, we can send it elsewhere in the world, is going to work either. Again, the world as we would like it to be and the world as it really is.
What do you think the solutions or strategies should be?
I think I'm a techno-utopian. That's from a technology point of view, not a political or social point of view, but I believe there is no problem on the planet that cannot be solved by the proper use of technology. And we have many technologies at our fingertips which can manufacture food with little or no arable land and fresh water, little or no pollution in terms of runoff, greenhouse gas emissions. If we look at using those technologies, we can create a world of food abundance without breaching planetary boundaries, but we need to apply those technologies correctly.
Can you give me an example of what that might look like?
There's lots of technologies around. One of the ones that I like is a really good example in terms of arable land and fresh water. There's a company called Solar Foods out of Finland. Now, they have patented machinery. They suck air into the machine. They separate out the water, carbon dioxide, and the nitrogen. They split the water using solar energy, hence Solar Foods, into hydrogen and oxygen. They use a chemical process, they recombine all these, and they put microorganisms in there, and they grow what's called biomass. And you can structure that to make alternative protein products. Now, if you're in the UK or Australia, you either know Marmite or Vegemite. Those products are yeast, biomass that's been turned into a paste to spread on people's toast and sandwiches. So you can grow food where there's no arable land and very, very little fresh water. So I think that offering these new technologies to these countries who are developing their food systems is going to be the best way to enable us to live as a planet within planetary boundaries.
I'm so glad that you brought up the kind of green impact and the sustainability impact, because Ireland in particular, I'm thinking of, has a very, very strong agriculture system and industry, and the agriculture industry is facing serious problems around that sort of push and pull against environmental impact versus the industry itself. What are your thoughts on that side of the system as we move forward?
I think that what we've got is we've developed a particular raft of technologies that lead to the yields that we get now. That doesn't mean they're the only or best technologies available. There's a company called Pivot Bio. They do a soil microbiome, and they can reduce the amount of nitrogen required by about 45 kilos per hectare with the same or better yields using their soil microbiome. Now, that's a massive saving in cost. The nitrogen there goes to the plants, little of it runs off. So that's where technology can come in for a win-win for the farmers to keep their yields up and for the population, but also for the environment. And if you look also, another technology is, of course, genomics. Now, if you look at the cost of the first human DNA sequencing, $100 million US. Now, there's a company in the US now saying they can do it for $100 US, a million-fold reduction in just over 20 years. There's a lot of companies using AI now. They sequence the genome of the plant and they look at it and they say, well, what happens if we cross this variety and that variety and that variety and that variety? AI, tell us what it is we need to do and what we're looking for when we do those crosses. So they can dramatically speed up plant breeding without any GMO, although I say that anti-GMO organisations are an existential threat to food. And if we don't do that, with the climate change we're seeing and growing zones shifting throughout the world from country to country, the current breeding techniques are not going to be quick enough to keep up with the changes.
What sort of challenges and roadblocks kind of stand in the way of implementing these new technologies and this new innovation and things like that?
I think that the three technologies which are going to drive the future of food are alternative proteins, cellular agriculture, and synthetic biology. And then you've got genomics and the microbiome as well. And we talked about the soil microbiome, but the human microbiome as well. And the major accelerators at the moment are AI, quantum computing, and sensors. I think the biggest problem we've got in advanced food system countries is regulation. It used to be you could look out there and say, oh, here comes a technology. It's probably about 10 years away. Oh, look, it's 5 years away. It's 2 years away. Oh, it's here. Oh, look, we'll get to the approvals in a couple of years or a year or two's time. Now, product doesn't exist. 6 months later, a startup has invented it. and they want to get it approved or evaluated, and they're told just burn money for 2 years while we have a think about it. And that's not a criticism of the regulatory organisations. That's a criticism of the fact they are not sufficiently funded or resourced to make the decisions in the timeframes that are required. What was good enough 10 years ago is no longer good enough.
Tony mentions lab-grown meat, which potentially represents a shift in how we think about and produce animal products. Lab-grown meat is basically tissue or meat grown from animal cells in a controlled laboratory setting, without the need to raise or indeed slaughter large numbers of animals. The idea is that it would have less of an environmental impact than farming livestock, that it would reduce the suffering of animals, and it could be produced on a large scale to help tackle food insecurity. Lab-grown meat has been around for quite a while, and it has been described as the next big thing in food for many years. That said, it has not quite taken off. I think back to 2013 when Dutch scientist Mark Post made a lab-grown burger. Remember that one? There was so much hype and interest. Newspapers were calling it the world's most expensive burger, and indeed it was expensive. The in vitro burger cost $250,000 to make and was funded by an anonymous donor.
The world's first lab-grown burger has been cooked and eaten at a news conference in London. Scientists took cells from a cow and turned them into strips of muscle, which were then combined and made into a patty. Researchers say the technology could help with meeting the growing demand for meat worldwide.
From a scientific perspective, it's awe-inspiring.
Lab-grown or clean meat is slaughter-free and potentially more eco-friendly because it uses less land, water, and energy. At least, that's the promise. Okay, we know what you're thinking.
That's nasty.
Ugh, doesn't sound right.
I'm not really into lab-made things. It's unnatural.
It just seems off.
Someday, the fish on your dinner plate, kind of like this one or this one or this one, could come from a bioreactor rather than the ocean. They're trying to grow fish meat in a lab using stem cells. You've probably heard of startups replicating land-based meat in the lab. Think beef, pork, and chicken. But lab-grown salmon, tuna, and shellfish are also attracting serious attention from big-time investors.
It was being reported as something that would completely change our relationship with food. So even though it hasn't been the game changer we were promised back in 2013, the interest in lab-grown meat does persist, and it actually has sparked other innovation in the agricultural sector, where they see this interest in lab meat as a reflection of our demand for more sustainable and ethically produced food products. To learn more about this drive towards ethical and sustainable agriculture, Jenny spoke with food and agricultural expert Christophe Pelletier, often known as the food futurist.
Paint me a picture at the moment of how you see the sort of food industry at the moment and the challenges that it faces.
Well, of course, it faces a lot of problems, but it's not just the food and agriculture sector. It's pretty much all the sectors. The entire society is facing the same problems. Food and agriculture, well, as I'm sure you know, is always a little bit pointed as the bad guy. A lot of blame is put on agriculture, in particular on animal agriculture. But we also have to realize that the food and agriculture sector also listens to this, and they also are taking a lot of actions. But there still needs to be more changes need to be made, because as we see, even if we have targets to reduce the emission of CO2, basically year after year is just going up and up and up. Because the problem is actually it's not one sector, it's not one country, it's not one particular area. It's really a global thing. The climate change issue has no borders, and I think we all have to collaborate and also all bring our own share to do something. But it's not one sector or one country that's going to really fix the problem. That would be nice, but it's not going to happen.
The agriculture industry, as you said, has come on leaps and bounds, I think, and technology, and I think is playing a particularly strong role in the agri-tech industry. What do you see in that space?
I think we would probably have managed much better if we had started earlier and organized a long-term transition. The problem is, it's not new. We've known about it for at least 50 years. But if we had already started by then saying, okay, let's have a 50-year plan, and we're going to start the transition with a 50-year back from now, things probably might have been different. But unfortunately, we're all much more focused on the short term. And very often when I see innovation, what I lack is really this sense of working together and having the big picture. And also the innovation is a little too much investor driven. They focus a little too much on having the very successful startup to be the next Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg. I would say, first, make sure that your innovation really works, that it really adds value, that it really solves problems, and look at the money as a reward, not so much as when am I going to be able to have an IPO and then cash in on my shares, which is unfortunately a little bit too much the case, I find.
And looking a bit more on, say, the biotechnology side, I'd love to get your thoughts on things like sort of the lab-grown meat or genetically modified organisms. You know, there was a lot of controversy, I think, several decades ago about, genetically modified foods. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you have to go back in time. When were the GMOs brought on the market? And I can tell you, it was brought about the same time as there was the mad cow disease in Great Britain. And the mad cow disease had been a major trauma, and that was really a major crisis. And then all of a sudden, there was this talk of GMOs, and by then, they were talking about putting a gene of a fish from cold water in a tomato, so that the tomato... So there were these whole ideas of frankenfoods, and I think that has really skewed the discussion pretty bad. When we talk about genetically modified organisms, I think you have to look at case by case, because it covers a lot of very different applications with a lot of very different consequences. It's difficult to say, putting a generic term on all those innovations and then say it's bad or it's good. And that has been also the problem of the conversation, because there's been people who have considered that any genetically modified organism would be bad. Then the industry which was producing those, of course, said, no, it's not true, it's not proven, etc., etc. So you have those conversations that are just completely destructive, because nobody is really looking at the fact. Like I said, you have to look at it on the case by case. There are lots of developments now. It's called gene editing, but it's kind of the same thing if you want, but doesn't seem to create as much resistance as before. They're working on really trying to improve a lot of plants in particular, and in particular against drought and against heat. Your other point was lab meat. Well, it's very popular at the moment. Everybody's talking about lab meat. It hasn't worked very well with the public. I think maybe they didn't understand the idea. Maybe they didn't find it was really exactly like meat. And I also think, for instance, Bill Gates was very involved in it. So there was a lot of investor money. There was big hype on the stock market. But I think early investors basically cashed in when that went on the stock market, took the money, moved on to something else. Then it kind of fades. So what I think is, there will be probably some possibilities, but all the claims, just like with the imitation meat, plant-based, alternatives, claiming to replace the whole animal husbandry, within a decade, that I find it's a little ambitious, quite frankly. And I don't even know if that's what we need to do. The future is not going to be about one solution. It's not going to be about one particular type of innovation. It's going to be a mosaic of all sorts of innovations.
To the best of your abilities, what do you see changing? What's the biggest changes or trends do you see coming to the food industry, in the next 5 to 10 years, or as best as you can kind of think ahead? If you're being optimistic, let's say.
What we see is that it's a very unpredictable kind of climate, from drought to floods to very high temperature to very cold temperatures. And I think really the focus, if we want to be able to keep producing food, is really to help the farmers to have plants and crop rotation that really is going to be able to cope with those swings. And I think everything that has to do with artificial intelligence and all the technology around the farms, the sensors, the satellite imaging, all the software we have, the drones, you're able to really monitor what's going on. And we really need to help farmers to be able to work towards that precision thing, to know exactly immediately what's going on, so that the system can take actions. So I think there is really a lot of good work to do. And I think maybe we should involve the farmers more, because they can tell you what works, what doesn't work, and why it works or doesn't work for them. In my lifetime, when I was born, there was about 3 billion people. Now there are more than 8. And it's going towards, normally, if the forecasts are correct, past 10. So we have to make sure that the agriculture can function and that the farmers can really be very productive. So we have to be cautious before, pointing the finger at the farmers and trying to demotivate them and discourage them or try to put them out of business altogether, because today we don't have an alternative to replace agriculture as we know it. So we all have to work together, and I think that's the big word, is collaboration, and I don't hear that enough.
Like Christophe says, we need a global and collaborative response to food insecurity, involving farmers and food producers and engaging communities most impacted by food insecurity is essential as we work towards a more equitable and nourished planet. Of course, what drives the food industry is consumer trends and the choices we all make in our own lives every day. Julianne Forrestal is a scientist and executive chef and is food transformation director at French food services giant Sci-tech. I wanted to get a sense from Julianne of the trends she's seeing amongst consumers right now and what matters to them. But we started, of course, by talking about what's impacting the supply chain right now.
The availability of food and how food has sourced has really undergone a seismic shift. I think transport has made food really easily accessible for possibly the Western society more so, but that has had a massive impact on the availability of food to those that maybe are struggling to source it. Obviously, we've had a lot of impacts from war and conflict, and that has given rise to a lot of challenges around food security and supply and supplier management. I think very savvy and aware consumers are really gravitating to availability and sustainability and the provenance of their food. There is a huge shift towards better quality meat products or dairy products. So people are really acutely aware of the husbandry and the agricultural position of their produce, and they'll probably be prepared to pay more. And then secondly, there's the sustainability piece. And certainly in the younger generation, they're more acutely aware of the impact of even their food and what's happening to the planet. So they are making a really conscious decision and a very informed decision as to the impact of the food that's on their plate and what they're going to eat. I think people aspire to eat local. I think climate has influenced maybe some of the availability of certain commodities. So tomatoes, potatoes, lettuces, they have been challenged with the weather and the change in Irish climate. Again, the same with certain species of fish. I think people are aware that there is challenges around supply. You can see it in the supermarket yourself. But I think when you support local, certainly there's really a sense of pride in your community.
So what's in store for the future of food? What are the trends that we might see emerging in the coming years? I don't think lab-grown meats or indeed meat have gone away, but I do feel that plant-based food innovation is probably going to be the most pervasive trend in coming years. From hydroponics to genetic engineering, from vertical farming to sophisticated urban grow spaces, the technology already exists to grow adequate food for our populations in the future. We already know, however, that climate change is having major effects on food growth through excessive rain and drought, and loss of biodiversity indeed. There are areas in China where workers climb trees with paintbrushes to pollinate fruit blooms because of lack of bee populations. So we certainly can't take our eye off the ball when it comes to ambitious international climate targets and indeed the new rewilding regulations. I do see consumer pressure for ethical and sustainable food production too as a growing driver of how we secure our food resources into the future. Ultimately, sadly, as we all know, one of the real threats to our food supplies will always be global conflict. One had only to see which countries were most affected by the grain shortages when Russia first blocked Ukraine's busy ports to know that some countries are more equal than others when it comes to food security. The Gaza conflict has been called out by many as an exemplar of the weaponization of food, and one need only look to Sudan at the moment. Clearly, food security is an issue that will not be resolved by technology and innovation alone, but by international pressure, often driven by the citizen in the street even more than their leaders. then leading to some level of conflict resolution. Perhaps we as future humans will need to be peace activists in our own right. One thing is certain, for a sustainable, equitable and fair food future, it will take openness of minds, continued investment in research and development, human ingenuity, and perhaps more than all this, the human peacemakers. This series is curated by the Silicon Republic team and produced by Shaun and Maurice. The interviews were conducted by myself and Silicon Republic editor Jenny Darmody. The podcast is part of Future Human on Silicon Republic, and for more great content, from filmed fireside chats to deep dive articles, visit siliconrepublic.com future-human. Thanks again to our series sponsor Hays, the experts in recruitment and workforce solutions.